welcome to Interface. My name is Tembi Samachele. So, the final of the AFCON is currently underway. Nigeria facing off against Burkina Faso, and they're leading 1-0, by the way. We wait with anticipation to see how that one will pan out. While the excitement is building up on the soccer stage, there's another big story involving a prominent Nigerian, and I say prominent in a very loose manner here. Nigerian Henry Okah was tried and convicted in a South African court on 13 counts of terrorism. He's awaiting his sentence later this month. The acts of terrorism were committed in Nigeria, but Okah was arrested and charged in South Africa. Now, tonight on Interface, we'll look at the dynamics of this case and what the conviction means for the fight against global terrorism. But first, before we get into that discussion, let's take a quick look at the following insert.
Henry Okah is believed to be a leader of the Nigerian militant group, the Movement for the Emancipation of the Niger Delta. The Niger Delta is an oil-rich region in southern Nigeria. Most of the 31 million people in the region live on less than $1 a day, despite the enormous wealth generated through oil mining. For years, they have had to watch their natural environment deteriorate because of pollution caused by oil spills and pipeline fires. Established in the early 2000s, the Movement for the Emancipation of the Niger Delta sought to address this very injustice. From 2003 and 2009, MEND and other militant groups attacked oil installations, kidnapped foreign oil company workers, and launched bomb attacks across Nigeria. Henry Okah is believed to have emerged from this cause and has even been named a founder of MEND. Many dispute this title, claiming that Okah was just an arms dealer who exploited the crisis in the Niger Delta for his financial gain. He has a background as a marine engineering graduate. Okah was arrested in Angola and deported to Nigeria in February 2008 and charged with 62 counts of treason, terrorism, illegal possession of firearms, and arms trafficking, offences punishable by death. He was granted amnesty in 2009 on the back of a promise that MEND would put down their arms. He was arrested in South Africa in October 2010, 2 days after the bombs exploded in Abuja, Nigeria, on the 50th Independence Day anniversary. 12 people died and 36 were injured. The South Gauteng High Court found Okah guilty of 13 counts of terrorism in January 2013. He is awaiting sentencing on February 28. South Africa put Okah on trial as part of its international obligations because Nigerian authorities have not applied for his extradition, according to the prosecution. The government is committed to fighting global terrorism and has instituted laws to ensure that terrorists are prevented from plotting attacks on South African soil or for finding refuge from prosecution in their own countries.
And our guest tonight is Otelia Mwanganidze, and she's a researcher at the Institute for Security Studies. And remember that you can join the discussion as usual by sending us your SMS to 33726 or sending us your comment on Facebook. Our Facebook page is Interface on SABC3. Welcome and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Otelia, we were chatting just during that insert about, a terrorist versus an act of terror or an act of terrorism and all of that. One man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. What makes Henry Okah a terrorist?
I think what makes Henry Okah a terrorist now, obviously, is that he has been convicted by a South African court for acts of terror committed in Nigeria in 2010. But what makes any act that a person commits, an act of terror, is how the community, international and domestic community, react to a person's crime that they've committed. So with both the instances for which Henry Okah has been convicted, both of them were intended to make people scared, to make people fear the work of the Movement for the Emancipation of the Niger Delta, which Henry Okah is said to lead. And so with both of these, the reaction from Nigeria, and as well as, you know, within Africa and internationally, was that this was clearly an act of terror intended to make people fear the movement for emancipation.
We're also chatting about, you know, my saying Henry Okah is a prominent Nigerian, and we're talking about how that depends on your point of view. If you are a member of MEND, for example, he's going to be your hero. But what makes this particular act, or these acts that he's committed, not be seen as acts in favor of the people of the Niger Delta?
Firstly, it's the nature in which they were committed. They're violent acts. They did use bombs to attack civilian targets in Abuja, which is something that, in as much as you might be pushing for the emancipation of a particular region in Nigeria, if the targets that you're now targeting are, for example, yourself and myself, then what you're doing is you're not exactly sending your message to the very people, but you are actually harming the people you say you're protecting.
Okay. So burning of the oil rigs, kidnappings, all of these things are horrible acts. But if you think back to some of the programs that we've had here on Interface, we spoke about, last week, we spoke about what happened in Mali, for example, in Timbuktu, and how a huge chunk of the heritage was burnt up there. And then we spoke the week before about Sasselberg and how, you know, there was a whole lot of violence involved. And talking to the people that are doing these things, they'll tell you that this is the only way to get any government to listen. If you want attention, you do something that is worthy of the attention.
I suppose it depends on what you look at in terms of getting the attention of someone. If it's toying, for example, or if it's actually bombing down a building, what you're doing to get that attention itself can be criminal. Doesn't necessarily mean your cause is a criminal cause, but if in order for you to meet the ends of your cause, you are using criminal methods such as, you know, using a car bomb, for example, or suicide bombing, which has occurred. You spoke about Mali just now, which more recently just occurred in Mali, where they saw their very first suicide attack. It is not so much that the movement itself, and I cannot speak to that, whether or not it is a legitimate or illegitimate movement, but what I can say is if they use illegitimate means in order to get the attention of the government, if they use criminal means in order to get the attention of the government, then they are not free of guilt because of that. It means they should use other methods, and, you know, with South Africa's history, there have been methods that you can use to get the attention of the government that are not necessarily violent.
I was actually going to come to that, and let's put this matter to bed. Looking at South Africa's history, the African National Congress was declared a terrorist organization, and that was because of the nature of what was happening at the time. Today, we celebrate the ANC. Would you say that looking further down the line in a crystal ball, you know, MEND, for example, we might turn around and say, actually, those people were fighting a just cause?
I think your opening line was very clear. You know, one man's freedom fighter can be another man's terrorist. But I will repeat what I've already said. If the means that you're using in order to get the attention of people are criminal, then people will regard you as such. We are in currently a new era, and that works out well for the ANC, for example. But you never know in Nigeria whether the movement, whether MEND, for example, will become known as a non-terrorist organization. But at this present moment, they are a terrorist organization.
All right, we're going to have to take a short break. When we come back, we continue this discussion, and we do welcome your SMSs 33726 and also your Facebook messages. Interface on SABC3. We're right back after this. Okay, just to keep you up to speed, Nigeria is still leading 1-0 in the final of the AFCON. But we're talking about Henry Okah, who's been convicted of 13 counts of terrorism or acts of terror in South Africa, and we're chatting to Otelia Mwanganidze, who is with the Institute of Security Studies in the International Crime in Africa program. Remember that we do welcome your SMSs 33726 or your Facebook comments on Interface on SABC3. Now, if you look at what's happened in Nigeria, the acts of terror were quite prevalent between, I think, right up until 2009, and then they started to quieten down because there was an amnesty program in that country. But if you listen to some of the complaints that have come through in the news from the people of the region, the Niger Delta, they say that their grievances have not been addressed, and that's why you're seeing the acts of terror starting up again. Is that really a fair assessment of what's happening there?
Arguably so. This is the point that MEND has been making, that they accepted the amnesty deal because they thought that there would be improvements in the Niger Delta, and they haven't seen these improvements. And so they've been reverting to using more and more violence to get the attention of the government, but they have been targeting civilians, and because of that it puts the government between a rock and a very hard place, whether to meet the demands of MEND or to protect their civilians. And ultimately the government has chosen to protect the civilians that are being harmed.
Let's look at South Africa's role in this. It's quite a prominent role, but the crimes were committed outside of South Africa. They were committed in Nigeria. Why not just extradite him and take him back to his country, let him be tried there? Why try him in South Africa and convict him in South Africa?
Well, South Africa under international law has a duty to either prosecute or to extradite. The reason why they didn't extradite him to Nigeria is because Nigeria did not send an extradition request. And so under its own domestic, continentals or international obligations, South Africa opted to prosecute Henry Okah here itself. And it's done this within the scope of United Nations Convention, but also within the scope of the Organization of African Unity's Convention Against Terrorism and its own domestic law. So as far as the law being on the side of South Africa on this, it is there. Had the Nigerian government sought an extradition of Henry Okah, then South Africa would have had to comply with that extradition request and send him across to Nigeria for prosecution.
But just out of interest, why would the Nigerian government, having heard that a criminal has been caught in South Africa, not want him to be taken back to Nigeria and be tried there? Why would they be okay with an arrangement where he's tried and convicted in South Africa?
It's the prominence of Henry Okah within MEND. He was known as the leader of MEND, and so having him in Nigeria could have had serious implications on the ground in Nigeria. It's not the first time where someone as prominent as you know, the word, using the word that you used earlier, as prominent as him has been prosecuted outside of his country. It's happened, you know, with Charles Taylor early last year, he was convicted by an international criminal tribunal for crimes committed in Sierra Leone, but they said they couldn't prosecute him in Sierra Leone because the Sierra Leoneans would have had his head. Basically, those were the words. And it was the defense that actually pushed for him to be prosecuted outside. So it's not the first time. And it's really more to do with having due process. And so if he had gone there, we can only theorize about it, but maybe people in Nigeria might not have been too happy with him being in Nigeria at the time, or the people of MEND might have tried to rescue him, if you would call it that, from the courts in Nigeria.
Speaking of the International Criminal Court, the ICC, would it not have been better to use those resources, capture Henry Okah, take him to the ICC, let him be tried there, rather than using South African resources to try and convict him?
The International Criminal Court does not have jurisdiction over acts of terror. It has jurisdiction over crimes against humanity, war crimes and genocide. So they would not have been able to transfer him to the International Criminal Court for that reason in terms of the subject matter jurisdiction. But also they wouldn't have been able to transfer him because the situation in Nigeria has not been sent to the ICC itself, whether by South Africa as a member of the court or Nigeria as a member of the court.
Okay, let's talk about the second main reason why Okah's prosecution is quite noteworthy, and that's because he was charged under the Protection of Constitutional Democracy Against Terrorists and Related Activities Act of 2004. That's what's happened here in South Africa. Just talk to us about the relevance and the importance of that act.
Pakdatara, I call it that because it's quite a mouthful.
It is quite a mouthful.
Pakdatara provides for what we would call a form of universal jurisdiction. Now, it gets that from, United Nations Security Council Resolution 1373, which essentially provides for countries to prosecute people who've committed acts of terror outside of their jurisdiction who are not from that country, but because of the gravity of acts of terror can be dealt with domestically. And so South Africa, in order to implement those international obligations, established this act. And in terms of that act, it criminalizes certain acts of terror, but it also provides for the prosecution. And with Henry Okah, it was quite easy, not least because he was living in Basonia here in Johannesburg. And so they could use that he was arrested in South Africa, and therefore they could proceed with his prosecution. But also, one of the charges for which he was convicted was that MEND had actually made a threat against South African interests in Nigeria. And so because of that, he was also convicted for those threats that they made against South African living abroad. So they were able to invoke jurisdiction in that way.
Okay. Now, there's been great efforts made in South Africa to try and fight against global terrorism and terrorism that's happening in South Africa. This is specialized crimes unit within the NPA. How does that fit into the Pokdatara that you spoke about and all the other different laws that we have?
The prosecutor who actually led the case against Henry Okah works for the Priority Crimes Litigation Unit, which was established in 2003, and its mandate includes prosecution of acts of terror, prosecution of treason, prosecution of crimes against humanity, war crimes, and genocide, and other crimes that have been identified as priority crimes for South Africa. And so this unit, it's got a team of about 6 or so prosecutors, deals specifically and only with these matters. So it's a specialized unit that is tasked with prosecuting, but also assisting the Directorate for Priority Crimes Investigations in leading their investigations in order for them to be able to identify, for example, where people are alleged to have committed serious offenses under both Pokdatara as well as the International Criminal Court implementation of the Rome Statute Act here in South Africa.
All right, Ottilie, I want us to talk a little bit about what makes South Africa vulnerable to these groups coming here and hiding out in South Africa when great efforts are being made to fight against terrorism. But we're going to have to take a short break. When we come back, we'll chat a little bit about that. Do stay tuned. Welcome back to Interface. Let's take a quick look at some of your Facebook messages. Mamela Het says, good move by South Africa. Criminals like Okah will know in future that this country is not a safe haven for criminals. Kabai Sifatsa says, Okah never testified in court. He exercised his right to remain silent. Nigerian authorities were less interested in Okah's case. Emmanuel Sibanyoni says, South Africa under the ANC leadership has made itself the judge and jury of Africa. They think they know it all, but forgetting that they only create enemies within Africa. Tapelo Ramaro says, most of the people take advantage of our democratic country. This is a good example to others not to take chances. Keep it up, Africa Bora. Now, some of these messages, there's a lot of them. Thank you so much for sending them through, by the way. Some of the messages coming through talk to the next point that I wanted us to chat about today, and that was, South Africa is doing so much to try and fight against any kind of crime, even terrorism. But what makes this country attractive for these criminals to hide out and to, conduct their business from here?
I think one of the things is just that South Africa is a bit more developed, if you'd call it that, than a lot of other African countries. So most people might not come here necessarily to commit crime, but they might be coming here for business opportunities and so forth. Some of those people might end up actually being criminals themselves. But I don't think people come here as criminals to stay here. But one of the things, and it's something that one of the people commented on Facebook, that South Africa should not be a safe haven. And I think over the years, there have been people who have come here, you know, hoping to hide somewhere, you know, in Limpopo, in the Northern Cape, where
like
they...
the 19 people that were captured
exactly,
from the DRC.
Where they cannot be caught. But then the reality is what the courts are trying to say to the people is, no, South Africa is not a safe haven for criminals. Before, and it's significant because up until Henry Okah was convicted, earlier, well, in the middle of last month, there had not been actually an invocation of Pogdatara to prosecute anyone from outside the country. But now the ball has been set rolling. So people will know that whether you are coming from Nigeria, whether you're coming from Sweden,
if you're caught here,
you will be prosecuted.
That's a good message. What does this say about the long-standing view that there is some kind of feud, unspoken feud between South Africa and Nigeria, you know, the battle of the two superpowers in Africa, and you know, there's supposedly that animosity between the two countries, but surely they had to work together to make sure that this was done properly.
There was a significant amount of cooperation between South African authorities and Nigerian authorities. One of the things that hasn't come out prominently in the media is that Nigeria itself is actually holding trials for 3 other individuals who were implicated in these 2 bombings, one of them being Henry Okah's brother.
Okay.
And sort of early last week, one of them was actually convicted and sentenced for assisting and aiding in those bombings. And so both in Henry Okah's case here in South Africa and in the matters there in Nigeria, I think the feud is something people might talk about over coffee, but the reality is when it comes to the nuts and bolts of international cooperation, Nigeria and South Africa worked tirelessly together to ensure that evidence was brought from the one country to the other, that witness testimony, people who are based in Nigeria were able to come down to South Africa to give their testimony. And that alone is testament to, at the very least, international cooperation between the 2 countries.
What about any kind of backlash? We know that MEND, the movement for the emancipation of the Niger Delta, has vowed to attack South African companies, Nigerian officials, etc., because of this conviction. What kind of backlash can we really expect from them? Should we take them seriously?
I think we should take them seriously. How seriously is another question altogether.
Yeah.
They did threaten to attack South African interests in 2011, 2012, and they didn't follow through on that. But that's not to say that we must put our guard down and assume that just because sometimes they make threats and they don't follow through, that they won't follow through. So I think it is important that people be aware of the fact that Henry Okah has been convicted and that MEND has sworn that they will avenge his conviction. But then also, especially people, South Africans that are living in Nigeria, they need to especially pay attention to their surroundings, but also just generally keep yourself safe as you do every other day.
So he's awaiting his sentencing next month. Will he serve time in a South African jail, or will he be sentenced and then be sent home after the 28th when his sentence has been given?
He will serve his time in South Africa.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Overall, what does this mean, though, for the fight against global terror? You know, is this a significant enough conviction to have an impact on a global stage, or is this one of those smaller ones that you think, oh, well done?
It is extremely significant. I think to downplay it, it would actually be quite ridiculous, in my opinion. It is extremely significant because terrorism is affecting the African continent more and more. Yeah. And if countries other than South Africa, other countries that are signatories to, you know, particularly African countries that are member states of the OAU who would ordinarily abide by their obligations under the convention, would actually use this as an opportunity to say our countries also are not safe havens for terrorists. And what that would actually do is ensure that Africans take ownership of protecting their own citizens against these criminals, but also make sure that people are held accountable for these serious offences that they're committing on the African continent.
And the message is clear. South Africa is serious about the fight against terrorism, no matter how it happens or where it happens. But thank you so much for coming through to shed some light on this issue. It has been in the news quite a bit, and it's helpful to get an understanding of the history and also what this means for the country and the continent as a whole. Thank you so much for coming through to talk to us. Otilia Anna Mwanganidze is with the Institute of Security Studies. And that's it for tonight. Let me just check the score quickly. It is still 1-0, Nigeria leading. Remember that we can continue this conversation on Interface on sabc3.co.za. That's our email address. Or you can catch us on Facebook, Interface on 3. From me, Tembisa Machel, and the team, good night.